All right, so show of hands, who wants to get started like right now? Okay, cool, good stuff. So my name is Gabriel Ryan. I'm a security engineer at Gotham Digital Science, our New York office, not the London office. I don't know if you could tell, but so a couple new things in this presentation. We're going to be talking about hostile portal attacks, which is it's like a variation of a rogue AP attack, which lets you steal Active Directory credentials without direct network access. And we're also going to look at indirect wireless pivots, which is a way of using rogue AP attacks as part of a kill chain that can let you bypass port-based access controls on wireless networks. So before we talk about any of this, we actually have to make like an obligatory kind of stop and talk about WPA2 EAP. So we're going to blaze through this because we don't have too much time. But before talking about WPA2 EAP, we also have to talk about rogue AP attacks because that's traditionally the method you'd use for attacking these kinds of networks. So rogue AP attacks, they're pretty much the bread and butter of modern wireless penetration tests. You can use them for stealthy man-in-the-middle attacks. You can use them for stealing radius credentials, all kinds of cool stuff. The most basic form is known as an evil twin attack. And the way that it works, if you see here, we have this, this diagram. And you notice you have all these devices that are connected to this access point that's operating with the ESSID 44 con Wi-Fi on channel 6. So if an attacker were to create his or her own hotspot with the same ESSID, the question is, how would these devices be able to tell the difference between the legitimate access point and the attacker's access point? And actually, it really just boils down to a competition between signal strength and signal to noise ratio. So if the attacker is able to overpower the legitimate access point in that way, the devices will actually drop their associations with the legitimate access point and connect to the attacker, causing a man-in-the-middle. So this is not a new attack. This is something that's been around since probably before the earliest reference that I could find to it, which was this wireless LAN security attack by C.W. Klaus back in 2002. In 2003, the infamous ASLEAP came out. That was built by Josh Wright. 2004, you start to see karma attacks. It's a new variation of the rogue AP attack, and that was Dino Deazovi and Shane McCauley. 2008, you actually start seeing free radius WP, which is this tool that was released by Josh Wright and Brandon Tonowitz. And this is when you start seeing rogue AP attacks used as a method of breaching WPA2 EAP networks. And then finally in 2014, you have the improved karma attacks by Dom White and Ian de Villiers from SensePost. And by this point, karma attacks have become less effective, so they were able to kind of bypass a lot of mitigations that client devices had developed over the years and make them more effective again. And actually, very recently, 2017, we had the Lure 10 attack by the guy who wrote Wi-Fi Fisher. It's a pretty cool tool. You should go check that out too. And that exploits the Wi-Fi sense capability that's built into Windows 10. And the cool thing about that attack is that Microsoft doesn't seem to care about it, so it's going to be around for a while. So, but the common trend here is that with all these attacks, they kind of fall into two categories. Rogue AP attacks have traditionally been used as a method of stealing credentials via man-in-the-middle attack, or they've been used for breaching EAP networks. We're going to do something a little different here. We're going to talk about rogue AP attacks as a means of lateral movement. So, just a little more background information. For those of you who are intimately familiar with EAP, aka Extensible Authentication Protocol, I know this is a bit of a simplification. We're going to go more in depth in a second. But logically, authentication occurs when you're talking about EAP. We're going to be focusing, by the way, on EAP-PEAP and EAP-TTLS for this talk primarily. So with EAP-PEAP and EAP-TTLS, authentication occurs between the supplicant and also the authentication server. And you kind of have this situation that looks like this, right? You have this client, also known as the supplicant. That's your wireless device, and it's going to send an authentication request to the authentication server. That's your radius server that's running somewhere in your network. The radius server then will respond with an X509 certificate. And the idea here is that the X509 certificate is used to prove the identity of the authentication server to the client. So at this point, the client actually accepts a certificate. A secure tunnel is established, and you move on from the outer authentication, which is where we were before, to the inner authentication, which is where you start seeing like credentials pass back and forth, and that happens through the secure tunnel. Now, the reason why there is that secure tunnel in the first place is because without it, remember that we're using EAP as an authentication mechanism to provide access to the WPA capabilities of the network. That means that before you complete that EAP authentication process, everything is still basically happening over open Wi-Fi. So that's a problem because without that secure tunnel, you can just you would be able to just sniff that whole process off passively and crack credentials offline. In fact, legacy implementations of EAP, specifically ones that used EAP-MD5, were very susceptible to this. So the complete picture, now that we kind of looked at the overview, For EAP, you have the supplicant or the wireless device, you have the authentication server, but then you also have the access point, which in the RFC is defined as the authenticator. The goal of the role of the access point is to serve as an intermediary, because the supplicant can only speak layer 2, and the radius server needs to be able to speak radius, which is up on layer 7. So you have this access point that's kind of in between and passing all this stuff back and forth. Remember, this is an open access point. So the complete diagram should really look like this, right? So the problem with this situation, remember, is that remember we mentioned that open access points are susceptible to evil twin attacks or rogue AP attacks in general. So in this case, we have the X509 certificate. If an attacker is able to use an evil twin attack, but this time instead of doing it with an open access point, they clone a WPA2 EAP network that uses PEAP or TTLS or something before that. What'll happen is that the victim client devices will be forced to connect to the attacker. They'll send that authentication request to the attacker, and the attacker then responds with either like something. They use a rogue CA to create a certificate or self-sign a certificate, and that gets sent back to the client. Now, at this point, it's pretty much up to the client to either accept or reject the cert. If the client rejects the cert, everything's good. But the problem is that often doesn't happen. So if the client accepts that X509 certificate, it actually will proceed to perform that inner authentication through that secure tunnel with the attacker, and that gives the attacker a challenge and response that can be cracked offline to obtain radius credentials. Once again, this is not a new attack. This has existed since 2008, so it's pretty widespread. So to make matters worse, right, it's not just the inner authentication protocol used by EAP-PEAP is MS-ChatV2. And anyone here familiar with MS-ChatV2? All right. Well, it's absolutely wonderful. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. And the reason why it's wonderful is that you could just go about the traditional way that you'd crack these the MS-ChatV2 challenge and response that you capture using this attack is using a dictionary attack. So you just kind of keep iterating through a bunch of passwords until you find one that works. The problem is that's slow. It's like cracking a PSK network, where you kind of have to sequentially try a bunch of things, and if you have a really long password, it can almost be unfeasible. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, MS-ChatV2 is also vulnerable to divide and conquer attack. Moxie Marlin Spike and David Holton back in 2012, they discovered that MS-ChatV2 actually uses the same 3DS encryption that NTLM-v1 uses, so you can reduce it to 56 bits of encryption. And with the right, if you shift your goal from instead of recovering the plaintext password to recovering the password equivalent NT hash, and use the right, use like a proper FPGA-based cracking rig that's sufficiently powerful, you can actually achieve 100% success rate in cracking these things in less than 24 hours. Actually, fun fact, anyone here familiar with Cloudcracker? Remember it? Yeah, it's been superseded by crack.sh, but the folks at crack.sh will actually crack MS-ChatV2 challenge and responses for free within 24 hours because it's just not a big deal to them. So, quick demo of just what one of these attacks would look like from the attacker's perspective. You have the attacker is creating this rogue AP, and you're going to see a client device associate or attempt to authenticate in a second. And there we go. And in a few seconds, what you're going to see is you're going to see an EAP challenge and response right there, as well as a username, which is the EAP identity, is going to show up on the screen, and that's the attacker capturing that. So, this is a pretty old attack. There was a remediation introduced to kind of deal with this, and this was EAP-TTLS, or I'm sorry, EAP-TLS. And EAP-TLS, it's really good because it uses mutual authentication using X509 certificates for the outer authentication layer. And this makes it really, really strong because it kind of stops those rogue AP attacks dead in their tracks. Unfortunately, any network administrators or recovering network administrators out there? Any show of hands? None? Okay. Well, so the thing about EAP-TLS is it turned out to be wildly unpopular because you have to have a cert that you install on every single device on the network, and that's actually kind of a pain to do, and it's even worse if you're dealing with an industrial setting, or you're dealing with a hospital, and you have devices where they may not even be compatible with client or cert-based authentication. So what it does is it introduces this classic security versus convenience scenario, where you kind of have, as a network administrator, you're kind of forced to choose between like a really secure authentication mechanism in the form of EAP-TLS, but it's also like really difficult to use, or a really insecure authentication mechanism in the form of EAP-PEAP, but it's kind of easier. So naturally, this creates like a market gap, where you have all these like, vendors that start crawling out of the woodwork to sell you this magic bullet that can be used to compensate for the security issues introduced by EAP-PEAP and EAP-TTLS, but are also easy to use. And the current trend in that area is to focus on breach containment. Instead of trying to stop the attacker from actually gaining access to the network, you instead kind of give up on that and focus on making sure they can't do any damage once they're already on your network. So the question we're going to try to answer today is whether this actually works, and we're going to kind of explore that in depth. And before we continue, I have a nice little cartoon for you, just a foreshadowing of things to come. Right, so the most popular approach to breach containment is the use of a network access control appliance. So the way that this is going to work is that you have this hardware appliance that, as soon as a device is added to the network, it distinguishes between unauthorized and authorized endpoints. And so a new endpoint is added to the network. The NAC is going to do something to it to figure out, if it's allowed there or not. And if it's not allowed there, it's going to be placed, in a quarantine VLAN, or it's going to block the port or do something of that nature. There's two different varieties of NAC that traditionally we've seen. And the first is the agent-based NAC. An agent-based NAC has a software component called an agent that is installed on every single authorized device on the network. And this agent communicates with the brain of the NAC and reports back details about what's going on inside the network endpoint. It does like deep internal checks. And this is actually really effective, but unfortunately you also have a situation where you have to install something on everything on your network in order to get this to work. So it's nearly as impractical as EAP-TLS. And then we have agentless NACs on the other side of things. And the thing about agentless NACs, they're completely external. They use passive fingerprinting, active scanning, stuff like that, to kind of externally try to validate whether or not a network endpoint's allowed to be there or not. And because of this, there's no need to have software installed on each endpoint. It's easier to deploy than an agent-based NAC, but it's also unable to examine the internals of network components, so you can bypass these things usually by masquerading as an authorized device. So this kind of brings us back to the same dilemma that we saw before. You're dealing with insecurity versus impracticality. You can choose the secure agent-based NAC, or you can choose the not so secure but easy to deploy agentless NAC, which in turn, back to square one, creates another market gap. You have this high demand for a solution that offers the deep interrogation capabilities of an agent-based NAC, but without all that additional overhead. So, this kind of gave rise to the so-called next-generation NAC, which is kind of attempts to be both worlds. There are a few really interesting examples of how to do this. I had one in mind that I kind of wanted to bring as a demonstration. I actually, it might have been a bit naive of me, but I actually opened a help desk ticket at work to see if I could borrow one from the IT department. And you can kind of guess how that went. And then also legal found out about it. It was like, dude, we got to be vendor neutral here. This is not good. So we're going to refer to this as vendor A. And because I guess right, the goal here isn't to like call out any particular vendor in particular. I don't really care, but it's more to illustrate a point of just how difficult it is to try to bridge that gap between like convenience versus security. So one interesting example is a device that uses WMI to interrogate new devices as they're added to the network, and this allows it to perform internal checks without using an agent, which is pretty cool. But the way that it does this is it authenticates with all network endpoints over SMB using a single administrative service account. The service account is given remote login privileges, usually as a DA account or something similar, to everything on the network at the group policy level. And this allows the device to perform deep interrogations, and it's still pretty easy to deploy. Anyone see a problem with this yet? Yeah, no, I love seeing these things on pen tests, believe me. It's time to go home. The thing is, it creates a single point of failure where this device is going to attempt to authenticate with any new endpoint that's placed on the network using this special service account. And what this does is you have a device that's sending God mode hashes to any new device that's added to the network. So, the most obvious risk this introduces, since it's using NTLM, is an SMB relay attack. Because if you want to pivot into something, you just join the network, wait for this thing to try to authenticate with you to check you out, and then you just relay that authentication attempt to whatever you want to pivot into. And of course, you can mitigate that by deploying SMB signing. It's worth mentioning that SMB signing is disabled by default on everything but the domain controller. Reasoning for that, I think, is probably because group policies actually downloaded over SMB. So I think that's like where Microsoft draws the line, is like, no, we can't do that. But even if you enable SMB signing across the board, it doesn't address the issue of having hashes sent directly to untrusted endpoints. So, interestingly enough, this vendor also they provide you with a piece of software that you can install on network endpoints to kind of remediate this issue. But this is starting to sound a lot like an agent. And considering the chief selling point of this thing is that no agent is required, I feel like we're just kind of back to square one. So, I mean, the reason why I just use this example is it really, it's clearly well thought out. There's a lot of thought put into this, but it also illustrates that there really is no magic bullet when it comes to security. Security with convenience is totally a paradox most of the time. So another interesting security control, right, that you see on wireless networks is client isolation. You see this on wired networks too, but it gets interesting when we talk about wireless client isolation because, well, more about that in a second. So wireless client isolation, the idea is that you prevent wireless clients from communicating with one another. It's often used as security control, especially on open networks. You get everyone to play nice and not attack one another. So the way 802.11 is supposed to work is that the AP is supposed to communicate it's supposed to mediate all communication on the network. So in theory, this means it means client isolation should work. We have this diagram here, and if we have this one laptop tries to send a bunch of nasty stuff to this other laptop, the idea is that it has to go through the AP first. The AP can just look, oh yeah, this packet is not going toward the distribution system or from the distribution system. Screw it. No, I'm going to drop the packet. But the problem is that when we're talking about a wireless network, client isolation is a logical control. It's not a physical control. The question is, how do you prevent radio transceivers from communicating with one another? A really awesome researcher, he's no longer with us, unfortunately, but back in 2005, Cedric Blanchard, his answer to this question was, well, you can't. And he developed this tool called EAP-TTLS that kind of allows you to bypass client isolation. This was later revived by Oliver Lavery from Gotham Digital Science. This was way before my time. But yeah, the way that EAP-TTLS works is it reads packets from the AP using a monitor mode Wi-Fi interface, and then just injects response to those packets as if it came from the AP. It's actually really simple, and it even gives you a nice little tap device that you can use that it bridges with the monitor mode interface, so you can actually interact with the network without even being associated with it. So it's pretty cool. There's some later tools that kind of build off of this. Aircraft Suite, for example, has AirTonNG, which supports WEP. You can do these attacks with WEP. It also has TKIP-TONNG. It's a little slower, but it still works, and you can do this attack with WPA1. The reason for this, by the way, is that WPA1 was kind of developed kind of hastily as a response to the vulnerabilities found in WEP. So it's basically like WEP, but with bandages all over it. So there's some theoretical attacks that apparently you supposedly could use them against WPA2. Hole 196 comes to mind, but it's really debatable whether these actually work. But for the sake of being thorough, just kind of throwing them in there as well. Here's just kind of a demo of Wi-Fi doing its thing. This is really, really small on my screen, so if it looks a little choppy on yours, apologize for that. But so in the top right here, we have a terminal that's bound to a VM that's going to host an access point for us. We're going to start the access point, and the terminal right here is bound to our host operating system, and we're going to do something with that. And then this is another VM on the left here, this terminal here, and that's going to be yet another VM. That's going to be our victim. So here we're associating with I'm sorry, this one on the left is going to be our attacker. We've just associated with this network, this open network, using our host operating system, and now we're going to send 5 ICMP requests from our host operating system to this access point. As you see, we get five ICMP replies, and that's expected. So over here, we're going to start a tool called Wi-Fi Ping, and Wi-Fi Ping is just a modified version of Wi-Fi Tap. It's a cool proof of concept tool that it's really simple. All it does is that anytime that it sniffs an ICMP request on the target network, it just responds with it injects an ICMP response. So as we run this thing, notice how we run it a second time, but instead of getting the expected 5 responses, we actually get 10, even though we only sent 5 ICMP requests. So that's just an example of kind of a proof of concept that shows that client isolation just doesn't really matter if you have an open Wi-Fi network. So food for thought. We've been talking about whether or not it's possible to actually contain an attack directly. So an attacker gets on the network and you immediately are able to do something to prevent this from proceeding any further. But I feel like this is kind of missing the point, and here's why. So the role of NAC in containing a wireless breach is to prevent an attacker from accessing a sensitive resource, or sensitive resources after the breach occurs. And the way that it does this is that when an unauthorized endpoint is detected on the network, one of two actions is going to be taken. Either the endpoint is going to be placed in a quarantined VLAN, or the port is going to be blocked off completely. So essentially violating access control policies, this is going to cause the NAC to impose some kind of restriction. In a wired network, this is going to be a physical restriction, so it's pretty solid. But in a wireless network, this can only be a logical restriction, much like what we just saw with Wi-Fi tap and client isolation. So to kind of drive this point home, let's imagine a pretty typical scenario if you're doing a wireless pen test. You're really cocky, you've breached this WPA2 EAP network, so it's using PEAP, and you're like, yeah, I'm on the network, and then you find yourself in a quarantine VLAN. And let's say you're trying to present this to a client as a problem, but they're like, yeah, but we have this NAC in place, so why do we need to secure this? Because any attacker that's going to get onto the network is just going to be quarantined like this. And as an attacker, you probably want to be able. It's true. I mean, as an attacker, your whole goal is to get access to the sensitive resources that happen to be on this restricted VLAN over here. So the question is, how do we get out of this situation? And this is where we start introducing these new attacks. So the first one we're going to talk about is called a hostile portal attack. And this allows you to steal AD creds without direct network access. So it's kind of the jumping off point for what we're going to do to resolve that scenario. So we have to review a couple things before we kind of explain how it works. It's really a combination of two things. One is a redirect to SMB. So in a redirect to SMB attack, the idea is that you either coerce or you trick a user into accessing an HTTP endpoint. And this HTTP server is specially configured so that all that it does is it redirects everything that it receives to an SMB share on the attacker's machine. And what this will do is that it will actually trigger, it will cause the victim to attempt NTLM authentication with the attacker in order to access that resource. So the victim accesses the HTTP endpoint, gets redirected to an SMB share, and now you have their hashes. There's a variation of this that instead of redirecting to an SMB share on your machine, you redirect to a non-existent SMB share, and then that allows you to run responder in the background because if it will actually, because it's non-existent SMB share, the net BIOS steps will actually fall back to LMNR and MPTNS, and you can do LMNR and MPTNS poisoning. So this is a really fast way to get hashes. Unfortunately, it also requires social engineering. You have to get the victim to access this resource in the first place. So we're about 5% through our escape attempt. So the next thing that we're going to combine with this is a captive portal. Captive portals are traditionally used to restrict access to open Wi-Fi networks. And the way that they work is that all DNS queries are going to be resolved to the captive portal page. And additionally, if you want to prevent people from just specifying their own DNS server, you can redirect DNS traffic to your DNS server so that they have to use your DNS server. And if you really want to be really thorough about it, you redirect all HTTP traffic to the captive portal as well. So a hostile portal attack kind of combines all this stuff, and it's based on the redirect to SMB. And what it does is that you first force the victim to associate with you, using a rogue AP attack. And then you use a specially modified captive portal. Instead of redirecting to a login page, you redirect to an SMB server share on your machine. So the whole process, what ends up happening is the victim is forced to connect to you, and then they're immediately redirected to your rogue SMB server, and they send you hashes. And it kind of happens in quick succession like that. So for an example of this working, I'm going to demonstrate this on an open network at first. There's a couple more steps involved with doing this with EAP, so we're going to do that next. But we see here, we've just sent, we're sending a few deauth packets. This will cause the, actually let me back up a little bit. So up here we have a terminal corresponding to the legitimate access point. And over here we have the attacker. And over here we have another virtual machine named Jenkins. I think that's Jenkins? That's Jenkins. Okay, that is going to be our victim. So the victim is currently associated with this network up here. We're gonna create. We're starting a rogue AP, and we're also going to deauth this particular BSSID, which is going to cause this client to roam over to the attacker. As we see here, it's starting the authentication process, and it's associated with our access point now. And now we just open up IE, and now we have these hashes right there. So the whole thing actually just, it's pretty fast. And interesting thing about Internet Explorer, by the way, you notice how like every time we were typing in something in the address bar, it would kind of capture the hashes over and over again? That's because most browsers will do like a lookup request to some website to autocomplete. So you can just end up capturing the same thing over and over again that way. Anyways, so that's pretty cool. But we really want to be able to do it with WPA EAP networks because that's the scenario that we're trying to address here. So in most cases, WPA EAP, we're talking about EAP-TTLS and EAP-PEAP. Both use MS-SHA-v2 for inner authentication. For EAP-PEAP, it's pretty much guaranteed to be MS-SHA-v2. EAP-TTLS, you actually have some more choices, but the strongest one out there is MS-SHA-v2, so that's the one we're going to worry about. So the thing about MS-SHA-v2 is it's actually a mutual authentication protocol. You know, at the very end of that authentication process, the radius server is going to have to prove knowledge of the supplicant's password or the client device's password in order for the inner authentication to succeed. So I mean, this is kind of bad because, you know, although as an attacker, you know, we can force the victim to authenticate with us using our rogue AP attack, and that lets us steal radius credentials. We're still going to, or hashes that can be used to get radius credentials. You know, we're still going to fail that final stage of the authentication process, and the client's not going to fully associate with our network. And considering that, you know, most of the interesting stuff that you can do with rogue AP attacks, other than stealing radius credentials, require that full association, this is a problem. So there are a couple of solutions to this. The first solution is actually it was pioneered by Dom White and Ian DeVillers once again in 2014, and this is the auto crack and add technique. This works pretty well with weak radius passwords. And if you have strong radius passwords, you just crack them offline and finish the attack later. We'll talk about both options kind of sequentially. So, you know, we're looking here. This diagram basically represents the final stage of the MS-SHA-v2 authentication process from the perspective of an attacker. So the attacker is probably going to be running host APD as a radius server, and the way that this is going to work is that, you know, the victim is going to send the attacker's radius server, host APD, that challenge response. But, you know, at that point, the host APD is going to would normally evaluate, you know, whether or not this is a valid response or not. And then what it's going to do in order to try to, you know, authenticate with the victim, that mutual authentication there, it's going to attempt to load either the password or the NT hash of the password, which is password equivalent, from the EAP user file. The EAP user file is like it's like a really simple, it's kind of like a simplistic database. It's like a text file that's used by host APD as a database that has information about users and their credentials and stuff. So it's going to attempt to load this password from the EAP user file and then use that to construct an authentication response that it sends to the victim along with the authentication success message. Of course, what's going to happen if we're using this attack to steal radius credentials in the first place, we're not going to have the user's password or NT hash of the password in the EAP user file. So this is where things are going to start to break down. So with an auto crack and add attack, the way that it works is that you know, when you receive that challenge response, instead of, you know, immediately trying to load the password from the EAP user file, you instead just say, you know, screw it, and just send the thing off to a cracking rig immediately. And then, you know, hopefully, you know, remember that MS-SHA-v2 can be cracked pretty quickly. Hopefully what's going to happen, if it's a weak enough password, you should be able to crack it within a few seconds. And then you just append it, you know, slap it on the end of that EAP user file, and then what will happen there is that host APD will actually load the password that you've just cracked, and you use that to construct the authentication response, then everything just gets sent off to the victim and the attack succeeds. It may not work the first time, so you may have to kind of rinse and repeat the attack a couple times until it finally cracks it in enough time, but it should work with weak passwords. For stronger passwords, that's not going to work though, because the timing is not going to line up. So your second option is you really have to just crack it traditionally and then come back and finish the attack later. That's actually not that bad though. You know, the only caveat that you're dealing with here is time. And remember that with a divide and conquer attack, you can crack these hashes fairly efficiently. So here's how this would work with the auto crack and add attack. And we're going to use a fantastically weak password for this. So it's going to look a lot like it is before. We have the attacker here, victim here, or I'm sorry, target access point here, and we also have the victim here. So as before, we've just de-auth the victim, and they've roamed over to our legitimate access point. Here we've captured the challenge and response, and then just kind of as normal, we're going to, you know, open up IE and watch, you know, that's going to generate HTTP traffic, which gives us more hashes. So what this attack gets you is lots and lots of NTLM hashes. You actually get similar results that you would get if you're using LMNR MBTNS poisoning. There are a few key advantages here, namely that in the first place, no direct network access is required. You don't actually have to go plug into a jack to get this to work. And also, you're not limited to a local subnet. You can get everything that's connected to the wireless network. It's also not a passive attack. You're not waiting for broadcast requests to start appearing on the network. So back to our scenario. We can build off of the hostile portal attack to do something called an indirect wireless pivot. And this is where we use a rogue AP attack to bypass that port-based access control that kind of got us stuck earlier. So here we are at our scenario from earlier, right? And notice here that we're on this quarantine VLAN, but there's also a victim device on this restricted VLAN, and where we want to get to. So assume that we have two network interfaces, and our first network interface is currently associated with the target network, and that's the one that has the IP address on this quarantine VLAN. If we use the second interface to force that victim device to associate with us, using a rogue AP attack, if we then perform a hostile portal attack, that'll get us NTLM hashes. We then crack those hashes offline. Pick up where we left off. We might have to go back and repeat the step where we get the victim to associate with us, whatever. But then at that point, you can use that access to place a timed payload, like a scheduled task or something like that, on the victim. And what this timed payload is going to do is it's going to execute after a certain period of time and send a reverse shell back to our first network interface, which is currently sitting on the quarantine VLAN. At that point, we stop our rogue AP. This allows the victim device to reassociate with the target network. It's still an authorized device, so it's going to get moved over by the NAC to the restricted VLAN, and we just wait for the reverse shell. And this could be the best NAC in the world, and it wouldn't even matter. So, that involves some password cracking. So, a more efficient approach would be to use an SMB relay attack. Of course, there's a little more conditions here. We need 2 victim devices at this point because reflection hasn't worked since MS 08068, I believe. But if we force both of these devices to connect to us, and then instead of simply using the hostile portal attack to capture NTLM hashes, we instead perform a relay attack from one to the other to execute that timed payload, and then just allow the victim devices to reassociate with the target network. We can still get the reverse shell that way. So here's a fantastic little demo of how this would kind of play out. I'm going to squint really hard to. So we're going to have our 2 victim devices are going to be over here, and we're going to have our attacking machine is going to be on the right, the bottom right of the network, or bottom right of the screen, and then over on the left, we're going to have our legitimate access point, and also another terminal that's going to send DAuth packets. So right now we're forcing the victim devices to associate with our rogue access point by getting them to roam using DAuth packets, and we just do that with both of them. And then when they're both associated with us, and it's kind of doing its thing there. See, we have one, and we should have the other one, like any second now. So the thing that you see here, we're actually going to be using Empire to pull this off. Anyone here used Empire before? All right, a few hands. For those of you who haven't used it, you can just think about it. This is technically false, and I think the creators of Empire would probably get mad at me for saying this, but it's you can for the sake of this demo, you can think about it as like Metasploit with PowerShell. So we're going to get the IP address of one of these victim devices, and we're going to just copy paste it and feed it to our SMB relay server. And you see this big chunk of base64 code, that's our payload. And our SMB relay server, when the SMB relay attack is triggered, it's going to execute that payload on the victim. So we start up the SMB relay server, and then we generate some HTTP traffic on this victim up in the top right. So we just do that by just kind of typing some stuff in the browser. All right, now you see all this activity there. That's the SMB relay server doing its thing. And pretty soon, at some point soon, we should see a connect back from our initial agent. And we see that green thing there. Okay, so now at this stage, both of these devices are still connected to our rogue access point, but we now have essentially a shell on one of these devices. So let's find out which shell we're actually looking at here. If we do a shell who am I, we see we have anti-authority system privileges. We do a shell host name. That's going to tell us which of these 2 devices we're connected to. And it looks like we're connected to Jenkins, so we're this guy up in the top left. And at this point, we're just going to use the schedule task module to execute another reverse shell, but this time back to our first interface that's stuck on that quarantine VLAN. After a set period of time. We're going to say 2 minutes in the future. And you're just going to set that up here. So as I was recording this, something really interesting happened. And that was that, being a derp, I kind of actually forgot to attach the virtual USB interface for the upstream NIC, the one that's on the restricted VLAN, to the attacking virtual machine. So like I was like, oh man, I'm gonna have to like re-record everything. So I reattached it, and you're gonna see this in a second. But then something really interesting happened actually. It actually did succeed anyways, and the reason for this is that I'd set 160 retries on that reverse shell. So when I reattached it, and you're gonna see that kind of happen, and you probably don't want to sit through it. See, I'm actually moving my mouse around because I'm so bored just waiting for the scheduled task to happen. Yeah. I'm sparing you the agony of that. That's where I'm like, this is kind of like the oh shit moment here where I'm like, yeah, whoops. But at this point, you see I start clearing my terminals and stuff like that to get ready to just redo all this stuff. I go back here, start to type back to get back to the main menu of Empire. No, oh wait, that's green thing down there. Oh wait, it actually did work. And what happened was that, despite the fact that the network interface wasn't connected, because there were 160 retries on there, it kept just kind of doggedly trying to connect back to, every now and then it would try to connect back to the Empire listener on the restricted VLAN. So I kind of thought that was cool. So I kind of left it in there because it kind of illustrates a good point about like good malware. Is that even if you can't get that initial reverse shell, or even if you can't, like there's maybe some restrictions that prevent you from sending traffic from the restricted VLAN to the quarantine VLAN, there are other things you can do, and you may be able to do some damage anyways. So the equivalent technique in a wired network would be like literally going up to a switch and just unplugging an authorized device from a switch, plugging it into your own network where you can attack it for a while, and then plugging it back into the network. And the reason why this works is that port-based access controls, they rely on the assumption that the physical layer can be trusted. In a wireless network, WPA2 EAP is the means through which the integrity of the physical layer is protected. And if you're using a weak form of WPA2 EAP, this means that an attacker can actually freely control the physical layer using rogue AP attacks. And this completely renders port-based NAC mechanisms useless. So what this demonstrates, the first thing that this demonstrates is that port-based NAC mechanisms don't really effectively mitigate the risk presented by weak WPA2 EAP implementations. And it also demonstrates that adding port-based NAC mechanisms to a wireless network, it doesn't make the use of EAP-TTLS or EAP-PEAP any less inappropriate if the network in question is used to grant access to sensitive information. So I'm going to make, before we kind of wrap this up, I'm going to make one last kind of ditch case for EAP-TLS. EAP-TLS, actually, it's not that as bad as it used to be. You can use group policy to configure 802.1x clients. And your best option is just to use an internal, like a private CA, and leverage AD as much as possible to deploy EAP-TLS. And if you have BYOD devices that you have to worry about, you can address that most of the time using a solid MDM or BYOD onboarding solution. And if you're really desperate, I guess you could even use Let's Encrypt. Although even on Let's Encrypt's website, in the part of the documentation where they talk about doing it that way, they have this big disclaimer that says, we don't think this is a good idea, but if you wanted to do it, here's how. So you do have options available to you. So just some closing thoughts. Just because wireless and wired networks operate similarly at the logical level, this does not mean that they work the same way at the physical level. And as a community, we really should question whether it's truly a sound business decision to neglect EAP-TLS in favor of a more reactive approach that focuses on access control and threat containment. And finally, if there's one thing you take away from this, it's that the needs for convenience and security are often at odds with one another, and maintain a healthy skepticism for proposed solutions that promise both. Thank you.